Lyra's knees were already shaking, and the ceremony had not even reached her side of the courtyard. She had been standing since the sun touched the western wall, and now the moon was high and cold above the stone towers of Blackridge Hall. Around her, dozens of young women stood in two long straight lines, dressed in pale ceremonial robes, waiting for the Alpha King to walk past them and choose his mate by scent. Lyra wore no robe. She wore the same gray dress she had scrubbed floors in that morning, because nobody had expected her to be part of the line at all. "Stand straight," Edith hissed from behind her, close enough that only Lyra could hear. "If you embarrass this family tonight, you will regret it for the rest of your life." Lyra did not answer. She had learned, over the 6 years since her father died, that answering Edith only made things worse. It was easier to stay quiet, to keep her eyes down, to let the insults slide off her like rain off stone. She had come to Blackridge Hall tonight, only to carry her stepsisters' cloaks and fetch water when they were thirsty. Nobody had planned for her to be pushed into the line of candidates. But Nora, the younger of her two stepsisters, had thought it would be funny to shove Lyra forward when the guards were counting heads, laughing behind her hand as Lyra stumbled into the row of hopeful girls. "Let her stand there," Edith had said afterward, smiling in that thin, cold way she always smiled. "Let everyone see what happens when a girl like her tries to reach above her station. It will be a good lesson." That had been hours ago. Now Lyra's feet had gone numb inside her worn shoes, and a dull ache had settled behind her eyes. She had not eaten since morning. She had not had a single drop of water since the ceremony began, though she had watched servants bring cups to the other girls, one by one, skipping over her as if she were invisible. The night air of the kingdom of Vaymore was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow down from the mountains that ringed the valley. Torches lined the courtyard, their flames snapping in the wind, throwing long shadows across the stone. Somewhere far down the line, near the front gates, Lyra could hear low murmurs beginning to spread. The king had entered. Cain Draven, Alpha King of Vaymore, was said to be a man untouched by mercy or warmth. He had ruled for 12 years, since the sudden death of his father, and in that time he had never once smiled in public, never once shown weakness in front of his people. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and when he walked, soldiers straightened their backs and servants lowered their gazes. Every year, at the blood moon ceremony, he was required by ancient law to walk the lines of unmated wolves and search for the scent of his true mate, the one bond that even a king could not choose or refuse. Every year, for 12 years, he had reached the end of the line and simply walked away. Tonight, Lyra did not care whether he found his mate or not. She only wanted to survive the next few hours without fainting in front of the entire kingdom. "Do you see him?" whispered a girl, 2 places down the line, a noble's daughter named Clara, who Lyra recognized from the market square. Clara's eyes were bright with excitement. "They say he has not even glanced at a single woman in years. Maybe tonight is different." Lyra said nothing. Her vision had begun to blur slightly at the edges, the torches smearing into long streaks of orange light. She blinked hard and forced herself to focus on the stones beneath her feet, counting the cracks in the pavement to keep her mind from drifting. Behind her, Edith spoke again, quiet and sharp as a blade. "Do not you dare fall. Do not you dare give this family one more reason to be laughed at because of you." It was strange, Lyra thought distantly, how much power those words still held over her, even now, even after everything. Edith had married her father when Lyra was only 9 years old, and within a year of his death, the house that had once been warm and full of laughter had become a place of chores and silence, and small cruelties that no one outside the family ever saw. Clara and Nora, her stepsisters, had learned quickly that their mother rewarded them for tormenting Lyra, and so they had become skilled at it, the way some children become skilled at music or archery. Lyra had thought, more than once, of running away from Blackridge Hall entirely, of disappearing into the forest and letting the family forget she existed. But there was nowhere else to go. Her mother had died when she was small, her father was gone, and the pack laws of Vaymore did not allow an unmated wolf to leave her family home without a sponsor. She was trapped, as surely as if she were chained to the walls of the house. The murmurs down the line grew louder. Lyra lifted her head slightly and saw torchlight glinting off armor. The king was close now, flanked by 2 guards, walking slowly past each young woman, pausing only a moment before each one, inhaling once, and moving on without a word. Girl after girl straightened her spine as he approached, hoping, praying, that this would be the moment her whole life changed. Girl after girl watched him walk past without so much as a glance back. Lyra felt her stomach twist. Not with hope. She had none of that left. It was simple dread, the fear of being seen at all, the fear that when the king reached her, dressed as she was in a stained gray servant's dress instead of ceremonial robes, he would ask why a mere servant had been allowed to stand among the noble daughters. She could already imagine Edith's furious whispers afterward, the punishment waiting for her back at the house. She tried to steady her breathing, in, out, just a little longer. But her body had other plans, the hours of standing, the hunger, the thirst, and the old, deep exhaustion that came from years of being worked past her limits, all pressed down on her at once, like a great weight settling onto her shoulders. Her vision narrowed to a small tunnel of light. The sound of the crowd became distant and strange, as if she were hearing it from underwater. "Lyra," Clara whispered beside her, sounding suddenly worried instead of excited. "Lyra, are you all right? You've gone very pale." Lyra tried to answer. She tried to say that she was fine, that she only needed a moment, but the words would not come. The torches blurred into a single smear of light. The stones beneath her feet seemed to tilt, slowly, and then all at once. The last thing she heard, as the world went dark, and she felt herself falling, was a gasp rippling through the crowd, and somewhere beneath it, closer than she expected, a low, sharp command in a deep voice that cut through the noise like a blade. "Stop!" When Lyra's mind began to surface again, she was aware first of warmth, which confused her because she had been so cold for so many hours. Then she became aware of movement, a steady rhythm, as though she were being carried. She heard voices around her, low and urgent, but she could not make out the words. Her body felt impossibly heavy, and every attempt to open her eyes ended in darkness pulling her back down. She caught fragments. A woman's voice, sharp with alarm, saying something about water and food, and how long the girl had been standing. A man's voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the others with a single question that Lyra could not quite understand, something about a name, about a family. Somewhere in the haze, she thought she heard her own name spoken, but it sounded strange coming from a stranger's mouth, careful, almost gentle, nothing like the way Edith usually said it. She drifted for a long time in that gray space between waking and sleeping, her mind replaying pieces of the ceremony, the long hours of standing, the ache in her feet, Edith's whispered threats, and then, right before the darkness had taken her completely, something else. A presence, close to her, warm and solid, and a scent that had cut through her exhaustion like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She had not understood it at the time. She barely understood it now. But some small, quiet part of her mind whispered that something important had happened in that courtyard, something that had nothing to do with fainting from exhaustion. When she finally woke fully, it was to soft candlelight and the smell of clean linen. She was lying on a bed far more comfortable than anything she had known in the 6 years since her father's death, in a room with high stone walls and tall windows draped in deep blue curtains. For a moment, she thought she must still be dreaming. Then a woman's face appeared above her, kind-eyed and older, with silver threaded through dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. "There you are," the woman said softly. "Slowly now. You have been through quite an ordeal." "Where?" Lyra managed, her voice a dry rasp. "Where am I?" "You are in the royal wing of Blackridge Hall," the woman said, reaching for a cup of water on the bedside table and helping Lyra sit up enough to drink. "My name is Mira. I am the king's healer. You collapsed during the ceremony last night. Do you remember?" The memory returned slowly, in pieces. The long hours of standing, the blur of torchlight, the falling. Lyra's face burned with shame. "I fainted," she whispered, "in front of everyone." "You did," Mira said, not unkindly. "You had been standing for nearly 7 hours without water or food, from what the other girls told the guards afterward. It is a wonder you lasted as long as you did. Something in her tone carried a quiet edge of anger, though it was not directed at Lyra. Lyra drank the water gratefully, her mind still foggy. My stepmother, she said slowly. She will be furious. I need to go back, if I am not there when she wakes. You are not going anywhere just yet, Mira said, setting the empty cup aside, and I do not think your stepmother's temper is the most pressing concern right now. Lyra frowned, confusion cutting through the last of her exhaustion. What do you mean? Mira hesitated, studying her for a long moment, as though deciding how much to say. Do you remember anything else from last night, after you fell? Lyra shook her head slowly. Voices. I do not remember clearly. The king was walking the line when you collapsed, Mira said carefully. He was nearly to your place when it happened. He caught your scent before the guards could carry you away. Lyra's stomach dropped. What are you saying? Mira's expression softened, not with pity, but with something closer to wonder. I am saying that His Majesty has not left this wing since he carried you in himself. I am saying that in 12 years of ceremonies, he has never once shown interest in any woman who stood in that courtyard. And I am saying that whatever he found, when he knelt beside you last night, it was enough to make him break every rule of protocol and refuse to leave your side until you woke. The room seemed to tilt again, though this time Lyra was fully conscious. That cannot be right, she whispered. I am no one. I am a servant in my own house. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake, said a new voice from the doorway, deep and low, and unmistakably the same voice she had half heard in her fading memory of the courtyard. I know my own instincts, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Lyra turned her head, and there, framed in the doorway of the room, stood the Alpha King of Vaymore. He looked different up close than she had imagined, from the market square rumors and the terrified whispers of servants. He was still tall, still broad, still carrying the quiet weight of command in every line of his body, but his gray eyes, which she had always heard described as cold and merciless, held something else entirely as he looked at her now, something careful, something almost uncertain, as though he too was still trying to understand what had happened in that courtyard. Your Majesty, Lyra said quickly, struggling to sit up straighter despite the ache in her limbs, dropping her gaze the way she had been taught since childhood. Forgive me for interrupting the ceremony. I did not mean to cause a disturbance. I will leave at once and trouble you no further. You will do no such thing, Cain said, and though his voice was quiet, there was no room for argument in it. He crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something fragile, and stopped a respectful distance from the bed. Do you know what happened last night? I fainted, Lyra said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. I embarrassed myself and my family in front of the entire kingdom. I understand if there are consequences. Something flickered across Cain's face, an expression that might have been anger, though not directed at her. You did not embarrass anyone. You were denied water and rest for 7 hours, while every other candidate was given both. That is not a failure on your part. That is a cruelty inflicted on you by others, and I intend to understand exactly who is responsible. Lyra's breath caught. She had not expected anyone, let alone a king, to notice such a thing, let alone to care. When I reached you, Cain continued, his voice lower now, almost private, though Mira remained quietly present near the window, and you collapsed. I caught your scent for the first time. I have walked that line for 12 years, searching for something I had begun to believe did not exist for me. Last night, I found it. Lyra stared at him, uncomprehending, or perhaps simply unwilling to comprehend, because the alternative felt too impossible to be real. I do not understand what you are saying. I am saying, Cain said quietly, that you are my mate. The bond does not lie, and it does not choose lightly. Whatever your family may have told you about your worth, they were wrong. I intend to see that corrected, starting now. The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, Lyra could not speak at all. Outside the tall windows, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over the mountains, and somewhere far below, in the halls of Blackridge Hall, she knew that word of what had happened in the courtyard would already be spreading like wildfire through the kingdom. She thought of Edith's face when she heard. She thought of Clara and Nora, who had pushed her into that line as a joke. She thought of 6 years of silence and small cruelties, swallowed down because there had been no other choice. And for the first time in a very long while, sitting in a warm bed in a room she did not recognize, looking into the storm-gray eyes of a king who had just upended everything she believed about her own life, Lyra allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Hope. But even as the feeling rose in her chest, a quieter, more cautious voice whispered beneath it, the voice she had learned to trust over 6 hard years, the voice that warned her never to believe good things could last. Somewhere beyond these palace walls, she knew, Edith was already awake. And Edith did not lose gracefully. Whatever this moment meant, whatever the king's words promised, Lyra understood with a cold, certain clarity that the hardest part of her story was not behind her. It was only just beginning. Edith Hollow did not scream when she heard the news. She had never been a woman who screamed. Screaming was for the weak, for those who let their feelings control them instead of the other way around. Instead, when the messenger arrived at the house just after dawn to inform her that her stepdaughter had been chosen as the king's mate, Edith set down her teacup very carefully, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing at all for nearly a full minute. Clara and Nora exchanged uncertain glances across the breakfast table, unsure whether their mother's silence was more frightening than an outburst would have been. "Mother," Nora finally ventured, "surely there has been some mistake." Lyra was only standing in the line because I am aware of why she was standing in the line, Edith said, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. "I gave the order for her to be placed there myself, if you recall, though I told everyone it was your idea. I wanted her humiliated in front of the entire kingdom. I wanted every noble family in Vaymore to see exactly what a servant girl looked like when she tried to stand among her betters." "Well," Clara said carefully, "it seems that plan has gone rather badly wrong." Edith's hand tightened around the edge of the table, the only outward sign of the fury building beneath her calm exterior. 6 years. 6 years she had worked to keep that girl small, quiet, invisible, a shadow in her own father's house, stripped of every inheritance that should have passed to her, every privilege, every chance at a decent match. 6 years of careful, patient cruelty, all of it built on the assumption that Lyra would never rise above the station Edith had forced her into. And now, in a single night, all of it had been undone by an accident of fate that no one, not even Edith, could have predicted. "This is not over," Edith said quietly, rising from the table. "A king's mate can be challenged. A king's mate can be discredited. If that girl thinks one lucky moment of weakness in a courtyard has changed her place in this world, she is sorely mistaken." She looked at her daughters, her eyes hard and calculating. "Get dressed. We are going to the palace. If Lyra intends to play the part of a queen, then we will simply have to remind everyone exactly what kind of girl she really is." Back in the royal wing, Lyra sat wrapped in a soft blue robe that Mira had brought her, staring out the tall windows at the mountains beyond, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the space of a single night. Cain had left briefly to attend to urgent matters, promising to return soon, and in his absence, the full weight of her new reality had begun to settle over her like a heavy cloak. She was going to be queen. The thought felt impossible, foreign, like a story she had heard about someone else's life. Just yesterday morning she had been scrubbing floors and fetching water, invisible to everyone who mattered. Now guards stood outside her door, and servants moved through the room with quiet deference, addressing her as "my lady," in tones that made her want to look over her shoulder to see who they were actually speaking to. Mira, sensing her unease, sat down in a chair near the bed. "It is a great deal to absorb," she said gently. "No one expects you to understand it all at once." "I do not know how to be a queen," Lyra admitted quietly. "I do not even know how to be treated kindly. It has been a very long time since anyone has." Mira's expression softened with something that looked almost like sorrow. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time you learned both, together." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Voices raised. A guard's firm objection cut short by a familiar, cold, commanding tone that made Lyra's whole body go tense before the door even opened. Edith swept into the room without waiting to be announced, Clara and Nora trailing behind her, all three dressed in their finest morning clothes, as though they had been preparing for court appearances for weeks, rather than mere hours. Edith's eyes swept over the room, over Lyra sitting up in the fine bed, over Mira rising in surprise, and something flickered across her face, quickly hidden, before her expression settled into a mask of maternal concern. "Lyra, my dear," Edith said, crossing the room with her arms outstretched as though to embrace her. Though Lyra noticed, she stopped short of actually touching her. "We were so worried when we heard what happened, fainting in front of the entire kingdom. How frightening that must have been for you." Lyra said nothing, watching her stepmother with wary eyes, waiting for the true purpose of this visit to reveal itself. "Of course," Edith continued, glancing meaningfully toward Mira, and then back to Lyra. "We came as soon as we heard the rumors about the king's declaration. Such rumors do tend to get exaggerated in the retelling, do they not? I am sure once His Majesty has had time to properly consider the matter, in the clear light of day, he will realize that a servant girl is hardly a suitable choice for a queen. The rumors," said a deep voice from the doorway, "are entirely accurate, and I have had a great deal of time to consider the matter, in the clear light of day and otherwise." Every head in the room turned. Kane stood in the doorway, having returned in time to hear Edith's last words, his gray eyes fixed on the older woman with an expression that made even Clara take an involuntary step backward. "Your Majesty," Edith said, recovering quickly and dropping into a deep, practiced curtsy, her daughters following suit a beat behind her. "Forgive the intrusion. We were simply so concerned for our dear Lyra's well-being that we came at once." "Were you?" Kane said flatly, walking further into the room, his presence seeming to fill it entirely. "That is curious, given what I have learned this morning about the 7 hours your dear Lyra spent standing in that courtyard without a single cup of water, while every other candidate was refreshed regularly. I have also learned a great deal about the household she has been living in for the past 6 years. My guards have been quite thorough." Edith's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed it back into place. "I am sure there has been some misunderstanding, Your Majesty. Lyra has always been treated as a beloved member of our family." "Is that so?" Kane said, his voice dangerously quiet now, and Lyra felt a small shiver run through her at the sound of it, though it was not directed at her. "Then perhaps you would care to explain why the household accounts, which I have already requested be brought to me, show no record of any inheritance from her late father ever passing to Lyra herself, despite the fact that, by Vaymore law, she was his sole blood heir." The room went very still. Clara's face had gone pale, and Nora was staring hard at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Edith's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Lyra to see the fury simmering beneath it. "Legal matters of inheritance are complicated, Your Majesty. I am sure my late husband would have wanted." "I am equally sure," Kane interrupted, "that we will discover exactly what your late husband wanted, and exactly what happened to his daughter's inheritance, in due time. For now, I would ask that you leave. Lyra needs rest, and I find I have very little patience remaining for pleasant conversation this morning." Edith's jaw tightened, but she was not foolish enough to argue with a king in his own palace. She rose from her curtsy with as much dignity as she could gather, gave Lyra one last look, sharp and cold and full of promise, and swept from the room with her daughters trailing behind her like shadows. The moment the door closed, Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Kane turned to look at her, his expression gentling immediately, the hardness melting away, as though it had never been there at all. "You do not have to go back there," he said quietly, crossing the room to sit in the chair Mira had vacated. "Not ever again, if that is what you wish." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. This king who 12 hours ago had been nothing more than a distant, feared figure in stories she overheard in the market, and who now sat beside her bed, speaking with a gentleness she had not known she still had the capacity to receive. "I do not know what to believe," she admitted honestly. "Everything has changed so quickly. I do not know if I can trust it." "I understand," Kane said, and something in his voice told her he truly did. "Trust is not something I can demand from you, no matter what the bond between us says. It is something I intend to earn, one day at a time, for as long as it takes." Outside the tall windows, the morning sun had fully risen over the mountains, casting warm golden light across the stone floors of the royal wing. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Lyra knew, Edith was already planning her next move, already calculating how to turn this unexpected disaster into an opportunity for herself. The threat had not disappeared. It had only retreated, temporarily, to gather its strength. But for the first time in 6 years, Lyra was not facing that threat alone. And for the first time in 6 years, she found that she wanted, quietly and cautiously, to believe that things might finally be about to change. 3 days passed before Lyra was strong enough to walk the halls of Blackridge Hall without Mira's steadying hand at her elbow, and in those 3 days, she learned more about the palace, and about Cain, than she had learned about her own life in the 6 years since her father's death. She learned that the king rose before dawn each morning, to review reports from every corner of Vaymore, that he took his meals quickly and without ceremony, that he preferred silence to idle conversation, but listened carefully when anyone spoke to him with honesty rather than flattery. She learned that the servants who worked in the royal wing did not fear him, the way the rumors in the market claimed, but respected him, spoke of him with a quiet loyalty that surprised her. She also learned, slowly and carefully, that Cain had been asking questions about her. "He has requested every record from the Hollow estate going back to your father's death," Mira told her one afternoon, as they sat together in a small sunlit study that had quickly become one of Lyra's favorite rooms in the palace. "Property deeds, financial accounts, correspondence. He wants to understand exactly what happened to you, and why." Lyra set down the book she had been pretending to read, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Why does it matter so much to him? What is done is done. I do not see the purpose in digging through old wounds." "Because a king who lets injustice against his own mate go unanswered is not much of a king at all," Mira said simply. "And because, if I know him at all, he suspects there is more to your father's death than a simple illness, as your stepmother has always claimed." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through Lyra's chest. She had never allowed herself to question the story she had been told about her father's passing. He had grown ill, quickly and suddenly, in the winter after her 10th birthday, and within 2 weeks he was gone. Edith had wept beautifully at the funeral, had spoken movingly of her devotion to her late husband, and Lyra, only a child, grieving and frightened, had never once thought to wonder whether the story was true. "You believe someone caused his death," Lyra said slowly, the words feeling strange and dangerous in her mouth. "I believe nothing without evidence," Mira said carefully, "but I have seen enough of the way your stepmother operates in these past 3 days to understand that she is a woman capable of great patience in service of great cruelty. A woman who could deny water to a fainting girl for 7 hours, and smile while doing it, is not a woman I would trust easily with anyone's life, least of all her own husband's." That evening, Cain found Lyra in the same sunlit study, sitting very still with her father's old signet ring, the one item Edith had never managed to take from her, turning slowly between her fingers. He sat down across from her without a word, giving her space, waiting until she was ready to speak. "Mira told me you are investigating my father's death," Lyra said finally, not looking up from the ring. "I am," Cain confirmed. "I should have told you myself, and I apologize for that. I did not want to raise your hopes, or your fears, before I had anything concrete to share." "And do you? Have anything concrete?" Cain hesitated, and in that hesitation, Lyra felt her stomach tighten with dread. "The physician who attended your father in his final illness was dismissed from his post within a month of the funeral, and left Vaymore entirely soon after. My investigators located him 3 days ago, living under a different name, in a village to the east. He has agreed to speak with us, though he is frightened, and it took considerable persuasion to convince him." "Frightened of what?" "Of your stepmother," Cain said quietly. "He claims she paid him a significant sum to remain silent about certain irregularities in your father's illness. Irregularities that, in his professional opinion, were not consistent with any natural sickness he had encountered before or since." The ring slipped from Lyra's fingers and clattered softly onto the wooden table between them. For a long moment, she could not speak at all, could not process the full weight of what Cain was telling her. Her father, murdered, not by illness, not by cruel chance, but by the deliberate hand of a woman who had shared his bed and raised his daughter and worn the mask of grief so convincingly that an entire kingdom had believed her. "I need to hear it from him," Lyra said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "The physician. I need to hear it myself." "I expected you might," Kane said gently. "He arrives at the palace tomorrow. I will be with you, if you wish it, though the choice is entirely yours." "I wish it," Lyra said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. The physician, a thin, nervous man named Tobias, who would not meet anyone's eyes for the first several minutes of the interview, confirmed everything Kane had suspected, and more. He described symptoms in Lyra's father that he had never seen before or since, a wasting illness that struck suddenly and progressed with unnatural speed, and a substance he had found traces of in the household kitchens that he had been too frightened at the time to report to the authorities. "Your stepmother came to me herself," Tobias said, his hands trembling around the cup of tea Mira had given him to calm his nerves. "She offered me a sum of money, larger than I would see in 5 years of practice, and she made it very clear what would happen to my family if I spoke of my suspicions to anyone. I am ashamed of my silence, my lady. I have carried the weight of it for 6 years." Lyra sat very still through the entire account, her hands folded tightly in her lap, feeling something cold and hard settle into place inside her chest, where grief and confusion had lived for so long. It was not quite anger, not yet. It was something closer to clarity, the terrible, clean understanding of a truth that had been hidden from her for 6 long years. "Thank you for telling us," she said finally, when Tobias had finished. "I know it was not easy." "I am sorry, my lady," Tobias said, his voice breaking slightly. "I am so sorry." After he had gone, escorted by guards to comfortable lodgings where he would remain until any formal proceedings against Edith could begin, Lyra sat alone with Kane in the quiet study, the weight of the revelation settling slowly over both of them. "I want her held accountable," Lyra said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "Not just for the water, not just for 6 years of cruelty, for my father, for what she took from both of us." "She will be," Kane said. "I give you my word. But these things take time and careful handling to ensure the outcome cannot be challenged later. Edith is clever, and she has powerful allies among the noble families who resent my refusal to choose a mate from their own ranks. She will not go quietly." "I did not expect her to," Lyra said, and found, beneath the grief and the anger, a small ember of something that felt almost like strength. "I have spent 6 years being quiet while she took everything from me. I am done being quiet now." Across the city, in the drawing room of the Hollow estate, Edith sat with 2 women whose families held considerable influence among Vaymor's nobility, women who had their own reasons to resent the sudden elevation of a servant girl to the position of future queen. "The king's investigation grows more dangerous by the day," said the elder of the 2 women, a sharp-featured woman named Rosalind, whose daughter had been among the candidates passed over at the ceremony. "If he uncovers proof of what you did to Aldrich Hollow, you will lose far more than your stepdaughter's inheritance." "He will uncover nothing that cannot be explained away or discredited," Edith said, though her voice carried less certainty than it once had. "The physician is a coward who will change his story if properly motivated, and Lyra herself remains, despite everything, a girl who has spent her entire life believing herself unworthy of love or respect. That belief does not disappear overnight, no matter how many soft beds and kind words the king offers her." "You intend to use that against her," said the second woman, whose name was Colton's mother, though everyone simply called her by her married title. "I intend," Edith said, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face, "to remind everyone in this kingdom, including Lyra herself, exactly what kind of girl she has always been. If the king will not release her willingly, then perhaps she can be convinced to release herself, once she understands the price her presence at his side will cost the people she still, foolishly, cares about." Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "You mean her stepsisters?" "I mean," Edith said, "that a woman who has spent her whole life being taught to sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of others is not so easily cured of the habit. All we need to do is give her a sacrifice worth making." The 3 women fell silent for a long moment, the fire crackling in the hearth the only sound in the room, each of them turning over the dangerous plan taking shape between them, a plan that would, in the weeks to come, bring Lyra closer to real harm than she had ever faced in 6 years of quiet suffering under her stepmother's roof. The invitation arrived on a cool morning nearly 2 weeks after the ceremony, delivered by a palace messenger who bowed low before presenting it to Lyra with both hands, as though the simple folded paper were something precious. It was an invitation to a formal dinner hosted by several of the noble families of Vaymore, a gesture of welcome, the accompanying note claimed, to the future queen, an opportunity for her to become better acquainted with the families she would one day rule alongside. Lyra read it twice, a small knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "Do you think it is genuine?" she asked Kane, who had come to find her in the sunlit study where she now spent most of her mornings, working with Mira to learn the histories and customs of the noble houses she had never been permitted to study before. "I think," Kane said carefully, taking the invitation from her hands and reading it himself, "that some of these families are genuinely curious to meet you, and others are almost certainly hoping to catch you in some misstep they can use against you later. Whether this particular dinner falls into the first category or the second, I cannot say for certain." "Then why attend at all?" "Because refusing every invitation only feeds the rumors your stepmother has been spreading," Kane said. "That you are unfit for court life, that you lack the composure and grace of a proper queen. The best answer to those rumors is not silence. It is your presence, handled with confidence." Lyra studied the invitation again, her jaw tightening slightly with resolve. She had spent 6 years being told, in ways both large and small, that she was not enough. Not clever enough, not graceful enough, not worthy enough of love or respect or a place at any table that mattered. She was tired, suddenly and completely, of letting that old fear dictate her choices. "I will attend," she said, "and I will not embarrass either of us." "I never doubted that for a moment," Kane said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made her stand a little straighter. The dinner was held in the grand hall of House Ashford, one of the oldest and most influential noble families in Vaymore, and Lyra arrived on Kane's arm, dressed in deep blue silk that Mira had helped select, her hair arranged in a simple, elegant style that felt foreign against her scalp after years of quick, careless braids done in the dark before dawn chores. The hall glittered with candlelight and crystal, filled with nobles who watched her every movement with sharp, assessing eyes. She felt Edith's presence before she saw her, a cold prickle at the back of her neck, and turned to find her stepmother seated near the head of the table, dressed in her finest gown, smiling that same thin, practiced smile she had worn at Lyra's father's funeral. "How lovely to see you looking so well, my dear," Edith said, as Lyra and Kane took their seats nearby. "Palace life clearly agrees with you." "It does," Lyra said simply, refusing to give her stepmother the satisfaction of a flustered response. The meal proceeded with careful, practiced conversation, and Lyra found, to her own surprise, that she was managing quite well. She had spent enough years silently observing the noble families who occasionally visited her father's estate to have absorbed more of their manners and customs than she had realized, and Mira's patient tutoring in the days since the ceremony had filled in the remaining gaps. She answered questions about her studies with careful confidence, discussed the harvest reports from the southern provinces with a competence that visibly surprised several of the nobles at the table, and managed, for nearly 2 hours, to avoid every conversational trap set for her. It was during the third course, a rich soup served in delicate porcelain bowls, that Edith made her move. "I do hope," Edith said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests, "that Lyra has been keeping up with her herb studies. She was always so talented with tinctures and remedies, back when she used to help in the kitchen garden." The comment seemed innocent enough, but Lyra felt a cold chill run through her at the mention of the kitchen garden, at the pointed way Edith's eyes flicked toward the bowl in front of Lyra, and then, just as quickly, away again. "I have not had much occasion for herb work lately," Lyra said carefully, setting down her spoon and studying the soup with sudden suspicion. "No, I suppose not," Edith said lightly, "though I do hope palace cooks are as careful as they should be. One does hear stories, does one not, about the dangers of unfamiliar kitchens." Kane's hand found Lyra's beneath the table, a silent question, and Lyra, trusting an instinct she could not fully explain, gave the smallest shake of her head. she did not touch the soup again. It was Mira, seated further down the table and watching the exchange with sharp, professional attention, who quietly signaled to a passing servant and had the remaining soup discreetly collected for examination, an action performed smoothly enough that only a few observant guests noticed anything unusual at all. The results came back within the hour, delivered to Kane, in a hushed, urgent conversation just outside the grand hall, while the dinner continued inside. Traces of a rare northern root, harmless in small amounts but capable, in the concentration found in the soup, of causing severe illness in anyone unfamiliar with its effects. A poison difficult to trace, easy to disguise beneath rich, heavily spiced broth, and impossible to prove, had been placed there deliberately, given how many hands had touched the kitchen that evening. "She tried to poison me," Lyra said quietly, when Kane returned to the hall and pulled her aside to explain, careful to keep his voice low enough that the surrounding nobles could not overhear. "In front of half the kingdom's nobility, at a dinner meant to welcome me." "We cannot prove it was her hand directly," Kane said grimly, "though I have no doubt in my own mind that she orchestrated it, likely through a bribed servant in House Ashford's kitchens. This was a warning, and a message, sent not just to you, but to every noble family watching tonight. A demonstration that you remain vulnerable, no matter how the king has elevated you." Something shifted inside Lyra as she absorbed the full weight of what had nearly happened. A shift she could not have named a month earlier, back when she had still believed herself powerless. Still believed the only safe path forward was silence and quiet endurance. It was not fear that rose in her now, though fear was certainly present. It was something fiercer, something that felt, strangely, like the first stirring of her wolf. A presence she had always sensed dimly within herself, but had never been strong enough, safe enough, or free enough to fully awaken. "I am done being a target that stands still and hopes to survive," Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to Kane, though he heard every word. "If she wants a fight, I intend to give her one worth remembering." That night, back in the privacy of her own chambers, Lyra felt something she had never experienced before, a warmth building beneath her skin, a restless energy coursing through her limbs that had nothing to do with the lingering fear of the evening's events. Mira, called quickly by a concerned Kane, arrived to find Lyra pacing the length of her room, her eyes flickering, just briefly, with a golden light that had nothing to do with the candles burning around her. "Your wolf," Mira said, watching with quiet astonishment. "She is waking." "Now?" Lyra asked, startled, pausing mid-stride. "Why now, after everything else that has happened?" "Fear and danger often accelerate a first shift in wolves who have been suppressed for a long time," Mira explained, moving closer to observe Lyra with careful, professional attention. "You have spent 6 years in a household that likely discouraged, perhaps even actively suppressed, any sign of your wolf nature. Combined with the shock of tonight's events, and the natural strengthening that comes from a fresh mate bond, it does not surprise me that she is finally emerging." Lyra closed her eyes, focusing inward for the first time in her life on the quiet, powerful presence she had always sensed but never been permitted to explore, and felt something within her answer, warm and strong and entirely her own. When Kane arrived moments later, drawn by some instinct of his own bond to her, he found her standing calm and steady in the center of the room, her eyes glowing faintly gold, a small, wondering smile touching her lips for the first time since the ceremony that had changed her entire life. "There you are," Kane said softly, crossing the room to stand before her, close enough to feel the new strength radiating from her, like warmth from a hearth fire. "I have been waiting a long time to meet her." "So have I," Lyra said, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something inside her that was not fear, not grief, not the small, careful survival instincts of a girl who had learned to make herself invisible. She felt, instead, like someone who might finally be ready to fight back. News of the poisoning attempt spread through the palace and the noble houses of Vaymor within days, and with it came a wave of scrutiny that Lyra had not anticipated. Some nobles whispered sympathy, quietly grateful that the future queen had survived an act of such calculated cruelty. Others, however, saw opportunity in the chaos, and among them was Lord Garrick Vane, a powerful and ambitious noble who had long resented Kane's refusal to strengthen alliances through a strategic, noble-born marriage. The people deserve to know their future. Queen can withstand more than a lucky escape from poisoned soup, Garrick announced at a gathering of the King's Council, his voice smooth and reasonable, though Lyra, watching from her seat beside Kane, recognized the calculated challenge beneath his words. I propose the ancient trial. Let her prove her strength and her right to stand beside the king, not through rumor or sympathy, but through demonstrated ability. The ancient trial, Mira later explained privately to Lyra, was a custom rarely invoked in modern Vaymor, a physical and mental test of a potential queen's fitness to rule, involving both a display of controlled strength before the assembled nobility and a private audience with the kingdom's council of elders, who would question her judgment on matters of law, mercy, and leadership. It is designed to be difficult, Mira admitted. Historically, it has been used more often to humiliate unwanted candidates than to genuinely test worthy ones. Garrick knows this. He is hoping you will fail, or refuse, and either outcome would serve his purposes. Then I will not give him either outcome, Lyra said, her resolve hardening with each passing day since her wolf had first awakened. I will pass his trial, and I will make certain there is no question left to raise afterward. Kane had argued against it initially, unwilling to expose Lyra to further danger so soon after the poisoning attempt, but Lyra had insisted, recognizing in the trial an opportunity rather than merely a threat. If she could prove herself before the full council and nobility of Vaymor, she reasoned, Edith's whispered rumors and Garrick's political maneuvering would lose much of their power. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation unlike anything Lyra had experienced in her sheltered, difficult life. Kane's most trusted guard captain, a steady, patient woman named Ivy, who had served the royal family for over a decade, trained Lyra each morning in the basics of controlled combat, teaching her to channel the new strength of her awakened wolf, with precision rather than raw, untamed force. In the afternoons, Mira and several members of the council instructed her in the histories and laws of Vaymor, preparing her for the difficult questions the elders would surely pose. Lyra threw herself into the preparation, with a determination that surprised everyone around her, including herself. 6 years of quiet endurance had left her with a deep well of discipline she had never had the opportunity to properly use. And now, finally, she poured all of it into becoming someone capable of protecting not just herself, but the future she and Kane were slowly, carefully building together. You are stronger than you believe, Ivy told her one morning, after Lyra had successfully executed a difficult defensive maneuver for the first time. I have trained many wolves over the years, my lady, and few have learned as quickly as you, or with as much heart behind the effort. I have a great deal to prove, Lyra admitted, catching her breath. You have nothing to prove, Ivy corrected gently. You have a great deal to demonstrate, which is a different thing entirely. Proving suggests doubt. Demonstrating simply shows the world what is already true. The day of the trial arrived beneath a clear, bright sky, and the courtyard of Blackridge Hall, the very same courtyard where Lyra had once collapsed after 7 hours of forced standing, was transformed into a gathering place for hundreds of nobles, guards, and curious citizens who had traveled from across the kingdom to witness whether the servant girl chosen as the king's mate could truly withstand the ancient trial. Lyra stood at the center of the courtyard, dressed not in delicate silk, but in simple, practical training clothes that allowed her full freedom of movement, her hair braided back tightly, her expression calm, despite the thundering of her heart. Across from her stood a trial opponent selected by the council, a skilled guard chosen not to harm her, but to test her control, her precision, and her judgment under pressure. The physical portion of the trial passed in a blur of motion and focus, unlike anything Lyra had experienced before. She drew on every lesson Ivy had taught her, every hour of careful, patient training, and though her opponent was skilled and experienced, Lyra matched him with a fluid, controlled strength that drew murmurs of surprise from the watching crowd. When the trial ended, with Lyra successfully executing the defensive sequence required to demonstrate mastery, applause broke out across the courtyard, hesitant at first, then swelling, as more of the assembled nobility recognized the genuine skill they had just witnessed. The private audience with the council proved, in some ways, even more demanding than the physical trial. Seated before 11 elders in the formal council chamber, Lyra answered question after question about law, justice, and leadership, drawing on both her careful preparation with Mira and the hard-won wisdom of 6 years spent observing, quietly and carefully, the way power could be wielded well or wielded cruelly. A tenant farmer on the eastern border refuses to pay taxes owed to his lord, claiming the harvest failed due to circumstances beyond his control. One elder posed, testing her judgment. How would you advise the king to proceed? I would advise investigating the claim honestly before assuming either guilt or innocence, Lyra answered without hesitation. A ruler who punishes first and investigates later breeds resentment and fear rather than loyalty, but a ruler who ignores genuine wrongdoing in the name of mercy invites others to exploit that same mercy dishonestly. Justice requires patience, not haste, in either direction. The elders exchanged glances, several nodding slowly, visibly impressed by an answer that showed both compassion and practical wisdom in equal measure. Garrick, seated among the observing nobles, watched with a tightening jaw as question after question failed to trip Lyra into the misstep he had been counting on. By the time the trial concluded, as the sun began to set over the mountains and the assembled crowd waited for the council's verdict, even Lyra's harshest critics among the nobility had begun to whisper, grudgingly, that perhaps the servant girl chosen by fate possessed more genuine strength and wisdom than her humble origins had led anyone to expect. The council's decision, delivered by the eldest member in a clear, carrying voice, declared Lyra not merely fit, but exceptionally suited to stand beside the king as Vaymor's future queen. A verdict met with widespread, genuine applause from the gathered crowd. Edith, watching from the edges of the courtyard with Clara and Nora beside her, said nothing at all, her face a careful, controlled mask that nonetheless could not entirely hide the fury simmering beneath it. Her carefully laid plans, first the ceremony humiliation, then the poisoning, and now Garrick's trial, had all failed to break the girl she had spent 6 years teaching to believe herself worthless. She grows stronger by the day, Edith murmured to Rosalind, as the crowd began to disperse, the golden evening light doing little to soften the coldness in her voice. We will need to move more decisively, and soon, before she becomes too powerful to touch at all. Rosalind's expression tightened with something that might have been reluctance, or perhaps simply calculation. What did you have in mind? Edith's eyes drifted across the courtyard to where Lyra stood beside Cain, accepting the congratulations of nobles who, just weeks earlier, would have dismissed her without a second glance, and something cold and final settled into her expression. If we cannot break her through humiliation or poison, Edith said quietly, then perhaps it is time we remind her exactly how much she still has left to lose. The letter arrived 3 days after the trial, slipped beneath Lyra's chamber door sometime before dawn, written in handwriting she did not recognize, but signed with a name that made her blood run cold the moment she read it. Tobias. The physician who had confirmed her father's murder had been staying under guard in a quiet village just outside the capital, awaiting the formal proceedings against Edith that Cain's counsel was still carefully preparing. The letter claimed he had discovered new evidence, something urgent enough that he dared not trust it to a normal messenger, and begged Lyra to meet him alone, before dawn, at the old stone bridge on the eastern road, away from palace guards who he feared had been compromised by Edith's influence. Lyra read the letter twice, her instincts warring against each other. Every lesson Ivy had taught her about caution screamed that this was exactly the kind of trap a clever enemy would set. But the desperate, pleading tone of the letter, and her own guilt over the danger Tobias had already placed himself in by testifying against her stepmother, made it difficult to simply dismiss the possibility that he was in genuine trouble. She should have woken Cain immediately. She knew that, even as she quietly dressed in the gray light before dawn, and slipped a small dagger Ivy had given her into her boot. But some old, deeply ingrained instinct, the same instinct that had kept her silent and careful for 6 long years, whispered that involving the king in every small matter would only prove Edith's old accusations true, that she was weak, that she could not manage her own affairs without constant protection. It was, she would later realize, the single greatest mistake of her entire life. The eastern road was empty and silent in the pale pre-dawn light, mist curling low over the frost-covered grass, and Lyra's wolf senses, still new and unfamiliar to her, prickled with unease as she approached the old stone bridge. There was no sign of Tobias. There was no sign of anyone at all, until the moment three cloaked figures emerged from the trees on either side of the road, moving with the coordinated precision of hired guards rather than desperate strangers. Lyra reached for the dagger in her boot, but before she could draw it, a fourth figure stepped from the shadows beneath the bridge itself, and Edith's cold, familiar voice cut through the misty silence like a blade. "You always were predictable, my dear. Guilt makes people careless, and you have always carried a great deal of guilt about the people who suffer on your behalf." "Where is Tobias?" Lyra demanded, backing away slowly as the cloaked figures began to close in around her, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. "Safe for the moment," Edith said, stepping fully into view, her expression calm and utterly without remorse. "Whether he remains that way depends entirely on how cooperative you prove to be over the next few hours." "Cain will notice I am missing within the hour," Lyra warned, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "He will tear this kingdom apart looking for me." "I am counting on it," Edith said, a thin, cold smile spreading across her face. A frantic king makes rash decisions, and a frantic king, faced with a choice between his kingdom's stability and his mate's safety, might finally be persuaded to see reason about certain inconvenient legal proceedings that have been threatening my family's future. Understanding dawned cold and sharp in Lyra's chest. This was never truly about harming her, not directly. This was about leverage, about forcing Cain to abandon the case against Edith in exchange for Lyra's safe return, a trade Edith clearly believed the king would make without hesitation. The guards closed in before Lyra could react further, and despite weeks of training with Ivy, despite the new strength of her awakened wolf, 4 skilled opponents working in careful coordination proved more than she could overcome alone. She fought with everything she had, landing solid blows that sent 2 of the guards stumbling backward, her wolf senses sharpening every movement with an instinct that felt both new and ancient at once. But in the end, sheer numbers overwhelmed her, and she felt a cloth soaked in something bitter and sharp pressed hard against her face, the world tilting and fading before she could break free. When she woke, she was in a small stone cellar somewhere she did not recognize, her wrists bound, her wolf senses dulled by whatever had been on that cloth, still not fully returned to full strength. Tobias sat bound in the corner opposite her, pale and frightened but unharmed, and the sight of him, at least, brought a small measure of relief amid the fear. "I am sorry," Tobias whispered. "She threatened my family. I did not write that letter willingly, my lady. Her men forced my hand." "It is not your fault," Lyra said quietly, though her mind was already working, searching for any advantage, any weakness in their captivity that she might exploit. She did not have to search for long. Cain, as Edith had rightly predicted, had indeed noticed Lyra's absence within the hour, and unlike Edith's calculations, his response had not been rash panic, but cold, focused fury, channeled into swift, decisive action. Guards under Ivy's command had tracked the group's movements from the stone bridge within hours, following subtle signs that Lyra herself, even unconscious, had unknowingly left behind, the faint, unmistakable trace of a mate bond that no amount of caution could fully disguise from a king determined to find her. The cellar door burst open just before midday, guards flooding into the small space with Cain at their head, his gray eyes blazing with a controlled fury that Lyra had never seen from him before. Edith, who had been standing near the door discussing terms with one of her hired guards, froze for a single moment of genuine, undisguised fear before her composure snapped back into place. "Your Majesty," Edith began, "this is not what it an." "Do not," Cain said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through her words like a blade. "Insult either of our intelligence with another lie. I have heard enough of them from you already." Within moments, the guards had subdued Edith's remaining hired men, and Cain crossed the small cellar in swift strides to kneel beside Lyra, gently checking her bound wrists and the fading effects of whatever drug had been used against her, his relief at finding her largely unharmed, visible in the sudden, sharp exhale he released. "I am all right," Lyra said quietly, before he could ask, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Tobias needs help more than I do. They threatened his family to force his cooperation. Kane's jaw tightened, but he nodded, directing guards to free and care for Tobias immediately, before turning his full attention back to Edith, who stood now surrounded by armed guards, her carefully maintained composure finally, completely gone. Kidnapping the future Queen of Vaymor, using a coerced witness as bait, employing hired guards to abduct her from the Eastern Road, Kane said, his voice carrying the full, cold weight of royal authority now, stripped entirely of the private gentleness Lyra had come to know. These are crimes that carry the severest penalties under our laws, Edith Hollow, quite apart from the murder charges already pending against you for the death of your late husband. Edith's face had gone pale, all her careful calculations, all her patient cruelty, finally collapsing around her in the cold stone cellar. I did what any mother would do, she said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence, to protect my daughter's future. You did what a cruel and desperate woman does when she can no longer control the world around her, Kane said flatly. Your daughter's future ended the moment you chose murder and kidnapping over honesty and patience. Take her away. As the guards led Edith from the cellar, her composure finally, completely shattered. Lyra felt something settle deep in her chest, not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something close to both. 6 years of careful, patient cruelty had ended, finally and irreversibly, in a cold stone cellar on a misty morning, and the woman who had spent so long teaching her to feel small and worthless had been reduced, at last, to nothing more than a prisoner awaiting judgment. Kane helped her to her feet gently, his hands steady and careful, his eyes searching her face for any sign of lasting harm. I should never have let you leave the palace alone, he said quietly, guilt evident in every word. I should have insisted on stronger protections from the very beginning. This was not your failure, Lyra said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. It was mine, for trusting an old instinct that told me to handle danger alone, rather than trust the people who genuinely care for me. That is a lesson I do not intend to forget. Outside the small stone building, as guards secured the remaining prisoners and prepared to escort everyone safely back to the palace, Lyra looked up at the clear midday sky, feeling the last lingering effects of fear and captivity slowly begin to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that felt, for the very first time in her difficult life, genuinely and completely like hope for a future finally free of the shadow that had darkened it for so long. The formal trial of Edith Hollow was held 11 days later in the Great Hall of Blackridge Hall, the same hall where nobles had once gathered for feasts and ceremonies, now transformed into a solemn chamber of judgment before the full council of Vaymor and dozens of witnesses drawn from every corner of the kingdom. Lyra sat beside Kane through every hour of the proceedings, watching as Tobias testified, steady and clear now that his family had been placed safely under royal protection, describing in careful detail the substance he had found in her father's household and the money Edith had paid him to remain silent for 6 long years. She watched as household servants, freed at last from fear of retaliation, came forward one by one to describe the small, patient cruelties they had witnessed inflicted on a grieving young girl who had lost her father and, in every meaningful way, her home in the same terrible winter. She watched as evidence of the poisoning attempt at House Ashford, carefully traced back through bribed kitchen staff to Edith's own hand, was laid out before the council in methodical, damning detail. And she watched, finally, as Edith herself, stripped of every advantage her wealth and cunning had once provided, stood before the council with nothing left to offer in her own defense but silence. Edith Hollow, the eldest council member, intoned, once every piece of evidence had been presented and considered. You stand convicted, by the unanimous judgment of this council, of the murder of Aldrich Hollow, the extended abuse and exploitation of his rightful heir, the attempted poisoning of the king's chosen mate, and the kidnapping of the future Queen of Vaymor. The sentence for these crimes, under the ancient laws of our kingdom, is permanent exile beyond Vaymor's borders, stripped of all title, land, and wealth, never to return under penalty of death. A heavy silence fell across the great hall as the sentence was pronounced, broken only by Edith's sharp, indrawn breath, the first genuine crack in her composure since the trial had begun. She turned to look at Lyra one final time, and for a brief, strange moment, Lyra thought she saw something almost like regret flicker across her stepmother's face, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold, calculating mask Edith had worn for 6 long years. "You think this makes you strong," Edith said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for Lyra to hear. "You think surviving me proves something. It proves nothing, except that fate is cruel and unpredictable, nothing more." "You are wrong," Lyra said, standing slowly, her voice steady and clear enough for the entire hall to hear. "It proves that I survived 6 years of your cruelty without ever becoming cruel myself. It proves that kindness and patience are stronger than fear and control, no matter how long it takes for that strength to be recognized. And it proves that no matter how small you tried to make me feel, I was never truly as small as you needed me to be." Edith said nothing further as the guards led her from the hall, her exile beginning that very day, and Lyra felt, watching her stepmother's retreating figure disappear through the great doors for the final time, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settled peace, the closing of a long, painful chapter that had shaped so much of who she had become. Clara and Nora, whose own involvement in Lyra's suffering had been considered and weighed separately by the council, received far gentler judgment, owing largely to Lyra's own testimony on their behalf, describing them as children shaped by a cruel mother's example rather than architects of cruelty themselves. Clara, in particular, had grown quieter and more thoughtful in the weeks since the trial began, and when the council's session finally ended, she approached Lyra hesitantly, her eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. "I am sorry," Clara said quietly, unable to meet Lyra's eyes at first. "For all of it. I told myself for years that it was harmless teasing, that you were exaggerating your unhappiness, because it was easier than admitting what we were truly doing to you. I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that I am sorry." Lyra studied her former stepsister for a long moment, feeling the last, lingering traces of old resentment slowly settle into something calmer, something closer to understanding than anger. "I forgive you," she said finally, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "Holding on to anger toward you will not undo 6 years of pain, Clara, but it will keep me tethered to a version of myself I no longer wish to be. I would rather be free of it." Clara's composure broke completely then, quiet tears sliding down her face as she nodded, unable to speak further, and Lyra found herself, unexpectedly, reaching out to offer a brief, gentle embrace before stepping back to rejoin Kane, who had watched the entire exchange with quiet, proud approval. The Kingdom of Vaymore spent the following month in careful, joyful preparation for the coronation that would formally crown Lyra as queen, a ceremony unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in generations, given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her to this moment. Word of her story, the servant girl forced to stand through an entire ceremony until collapse, chosen by fate itself as the king's true mate, and ultimately proven through trial and hardship to be worthy of the crown, had spread throughout every corner of Vaymore, transforming her from an unknown outsider into a figure the common people had begun to embrace with genuine, heartfelt affection. On the morning of the coronation, Lyra stood in the same royal wing where she had first woken after collapsing in the courtyard so many months ago, dressed now in flowing white and gold ceremonial robes that Mira had helped design specifically for the occasion, her hair woven with small white flowers that reminded her, quietly and warmly, of the garden her mother had once tended before her own early death. "Nervous?" Kane asked, appearing in the doorway dressed in his own formal ceremonial attire, looking, Lyra thought, both regal and, in the quiet privacy of this shared moment, unmistakably relieved that the long, difficult path they had walked together over the past months had finally led them here. "A little," Lyra admitted, smoothing the front of her robes with hands that trembled only slightly now. "It is strange, is it not? A year ago, I was scrubbing floors and fetching water, invisible to everyone who mattered. Now half the kingdom waits below to watch me crowned queen." "You were never invisible," Kane said gently, crossing the room to stand before her, taking her hands in his own steady grip. "You were simply waiting for the world to finally see what I recognized the very first moment I found you." The courtyard below, The very same courtyard where Lyra had once stood for 7 agonizing hours, denied water and rest, forced to endure humiliation and exhaustion until her body finally gave out beneath the weight of it, had been transformed for the coronation into a place of celebration, filled with flowers and banners and thousands of citizens who had traveled from every corner of Vaymore to witness the ceremony. As Lyra walked down the same path where she had once collapsed, now steady and strong, flanked by Cain on one side and Mira and Ivy close behind, she felt the weight of every difficult step of her journey settle into something that finally, completely, felt like peace. The eldest council member placed the crown upon her head with careful, ceremonial precision, and as the assembled crowd erupted into genuine, thunderous applause, Lyra looked out over the sea of faces, remembering, with quiet clarity, the girl who had once stood in this very spot believing herself worthless, invisible, and utterly alone. That girl was gone now, transformed not by magic or fate alone, but by her own quiet, unbreakable strength, finally given the chance to be seen. "Long live the Queen," Cain said softly, for her ears alone, as the crowd's applause continued to swell around them, and Lyra, standing tall and steady in the golden afternoon light, allowed herself, at long last, to fully believe every word of it. The girl who had once been forced to stand until she collapsed had risen, in the end, not because fate had chosen her, but because she had never, even in her darkest and most exhausted moments, allowed anyone to convince her that she did not deserve to stand at all.